Thank you. Welcome.
Good afternoon. My name is Amy Vanderwalker. I'm the coordinator with the California Environmental Justice Alliance. Communities for a Better Environment is one of our member organizations. We have also been working on the Exide issue. Other members include Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment, who is one of the co-conveners of the People's Senate, who Director Lee will be visiting with later this month. A couple of things, and I would just echo Gladys' comments here that really the decision to shut down Exide was really the result of extraordinary leadership from the Senate and from communities most impacted by Exide's egregious violations. And that is really what has led to, there's a lot of other agencies that have been involved, but we cannot overlook the extraordinary amount of work that had to go in to make that decision possible, and I want to make sure that is really lifted up. And it is true that this is not an exclusive case just to Exide, and it is a problem throughout with other facilities. In terms of the discussion this morning, I just wanted to highlight a couple things. There was a lot of talk about permitting and how to clear the permitting backlog. One thing that I did not hear clearly articulated was how environmental justice concerns will be included in any permitting decisions moving forward as this backlog is tried to be cleared. You know, one significant issue is as the department is under pressure to move through this backlog, that you just expedite permits. And clearly we can see in the case you know, of Exide, when there's not proper consideration going into permitting decisions, that could have significant drawbacks for public health and for communities across California. So ensuring their environmental justice is included in the permitting decisions is extremely important. And we just haven't heard a clear articulation on what the permitting criteria is. A lot about how there's addressing these internal backlogs, internal bottlenecks, but what are the criteria for which permitting decisions are being made? That is still a significant concern for our coalition. A second thing on the cleanup and the orphan sites, a lot of discussion about how this impact of taking over Superfund sites will impact the state budget, and to hear Director Lee say that there will be a delay on cleanup of state orphan sites because of the turnover from federal sites to state responsibility and costs is frankly unacceptable. To not hear that there is a more clear plan moving forward on how all of the existing orphan sites, many of which are located in communities of color, are not going to be cleaned up in a fast manner when they have really been contaminated for decades. I mean, we're talking about decades of contamination directly next to people's homes and playgrounds. And to not hear the department articulating a aggressive plan to figure out how we're going to fund and clean up all of these orphan sites is truly distressing. So I encourage more oversight of that particular issue. Finally, one issue that did seem completely missing from the discussion this morning was overall accountability and transparency at the department. Lots of talk about all these things that are happening, but still there is a basic lack of accountability with the public and specifically with communities most impacted. And a lack of transparency. And I understand that the new director is new and still working to change that. But given the many years of distrust and failures on the part of the department, that issue really needs to be addressed. We have a couple of solutions, a couple of ideas that we would encourage the committee to look into as you're making your decisions around budget, community oversight, and some more formal mechanism for community oversight of department actions would be welcome. And also exploring why this department does not have a board, as many of the other boards and offices within Cal EPA have, I think is really worth your investigation. Encourage you to encourage the department to look into that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, both of you. Further public comment? All right, then I will close this portion of the hearing. This is of the committee meeting, the oversight hearing, and say goodbye to my co-chair. And I hope welcome back Senator Nielsen, because Senator Pavley is not here. We do need a quorum so we can begin to take action. First, there will be a special presentation before we actually deal with 3 departments and a board. Is Matt here yet? Oh, there you are. Welcome. All right, and Brian, both of you from the Matt Rodriguez, who's the secretary for Cal EPA, and Brian Brown, who's with the LAO's office. Don't go far, Director Lee. Thank you very much, by the way. But you're not off the hot seat yet.
Provided him with the most rare beer that I could. Okay.
The pro tem also asked me to acknowledge that in addition to the oral comments that were made and public comment on the hearing, that in fact, I should acknowledge that there were a great many written comments, and those will be and are available publicly. So let me welcome the Secretary. Welcome, welcome, and welcome to the LAO.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And let me just say it's a pleasure to be here. I understand you've had a very, very long
We did.
today. I've had the pleasure to listen to some of it from my office. So perhaps let me offer this. I can talk a little bit about the budget for Cal EPA and our 6 offices, departments, and boards. But in view of the time, maybe I should say if you've got any questions, maybe that may be the most efficient way to proceed here.
Yes. You can make a brief opening statement if you like.
Okay. Well, let me just say, note that the entire Cal EPA budget is a little over $3.8 billion. Of that, I should note that only 1.8% is general fund. This budget supports just under 5,700 positions with 6 boards, departments, and offices under my purview. I also want to note that the offices, the Secretary's office, has a very, very modest budget of only $19 million and 69 positions. California, of course, has some of the most far-reaching environmental programs and policies in the country, if not the world, and I think the budget reflects that. I would note that there are a couple of highlights in this year's budget. That is cap and trade expenditures from ARB. I'm sure know that this year's budget has over $830 million in expenditures of cap and trade funds for various programs that will further reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The budget that has been proposed by the governor has $1 billion in expenditures in the same kinds of programs for the current fiscal year. I can ask any or answer any questions that you might have about those programs if you have questions on some of those programs. Additionally, because of Prop 1, there will be money available for drinking water and water improvements in California. The State Water Board budget includes, in fact, $268 million in Proposition 1 bond money to meet California's commitment to making sure that every Californian has access to safe drinking water. The State Board, through its Drinking Water Division, and I should note that that Drinking Water Division was just moved to the State Board from the Department of Public Health, and I think both the Department and the Board should be congratulated for a relatively seamless transition of that program into the State Board. The Drinking Water Division is working on making sure that Californians have reliable access to safe drinking water. To that point, the budget provides $69 million in loans and grants for public water system infrastructure improvements and related actions to meet safe drinking water standards and ensure affordable drinking water. Additionally, $66 million is proposed for grants to small communities with priority given to disadvantaged communities for wastewater treatment programs. And further, $132 million proposed for grants and loans to fund water recycling and advanced treatment technology projects. So those are just some of the highlights of that budget. You've, of course, heard about the department's budget, so I won't go into any great detail on the Department of Toxic Substances Control, but as I said, I'm available to answer any questions about any of those agencies or the 3 remaining departments or boards in Cal EPA, Cal Recycle, the Department of Pesticide Regulation, and the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessments.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. First, let's form a quorum. Please call the roll.
Senator Wolk?
Here.
Senator Nielsen? Here. Senator Pavley?
And we have a quorum. Mr. Brown, your turn from the LAO, and then we'll move right to the budget.
All right.
Or
Thank you, Madam Chair.
questions.
Brian Brown with the Legislative Analyst's Office. The Sergeant did pass out a brief handout, which is similar to the one I presented last week on Natural Resources Agency. I'll move through this very quickly, but just to give you some high-level context as you begin your deliberations. On page 1, as you can see, the total funding proposed for the Environmental Protection Agency and its 6-member departments and boards is $3.7 billion in 2015-16. And different than natural resources, this is primarily made up of special funds, which generally derive from different fees on regulated entities. If you turn to page 2, you can see how this funding level has changed as compared to the current year estimated expenditures and prior year actual expenditures. A total of $98 million in decrease proposed compared to the prior year. This is made up of a few different components. General fund is proposed to be down just a little bit, about $10 million. That's largely because of the drought-related funding. There's some funding that was previously general fund that has been shifted to special fund, so that doesn't really reflect a significant programmatic change. Special fund is proposed to increase by about $112 million, and this is, there are multiple things that result in that net figure, but the single biggest change is a proposal you'll see later this year in your deliberation related to the implementation of new policy changes around the underground storage tank program. Bond funding is down by about $200 million. This is primarily related to one-time funding in the current year related to Proposition 1B in the ARB's budget. If you turn to page 3, this just shows some of that detail broken out a little bit more for the 5 largest departments within the agency, Cal Recycle being the largest, and Water Board second, and you can see some of these changes in more detail. Again, won't go through them, but certainly wanted to make sure you had that detail. I believe it's in your agenda as well. And then finally on page 4, wanted to highlight just a couple of the largest changes. The Secretary mentioned a couple of these as well. Proposition 1, which we talked about last week, just to note that about half of the funding proposed in the governor's budget from Proposition 1, the water bond passed in November, about half of the funding proposed is for the Water Board for the programs described by the Secretary. Second, cap and trade revenues. Again, as we talked about last week, the budget does include an estimate of about $1 billion in funding for various transportation, environmental, and resource programs. Of that total, $225 million would be for environmental protection programs. We did note last week too, though, just to remind you that we estimate that in all likelihood funding will be much larger than what's currently assumed in the budget, and that has implications for you on some of your funding decisions in the coming year. And then lastly is an item that's on your agenda today, so I won't spend too much time on it, but just the Air Resources Board does have the first level of funding, first amount of funding for a very significant capital outlay project, and the concern we've raised in this case is just that we think there will be, and it's important for this committee to have much more detail on the specific details of funding and programmatic demands on the facility. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions that you have of either? Okay, I just have one, and that has to do with, you heard, Mr. Secretary, the previous hearing, and certainly, or your staff told you about most of it. This department is struggling, and I'd like to hear from you what your office is doing to assist them in continuing with this, fixing the foundation and the numbers of problems they have with the new director.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll just say that the Office of the Secretary realizes that this is a department that needs assistance from my office. We have a Deputy Secretary who works very, very closely with the department. And we have worked with them in a number of the reviews they've conducted of their program, both their permitting program, their fiscal accountability program, and we continue to work with the personnel there to try and frankly bring around a change in culture to make it a department that will focus on efficiency, getting decisions out the door, redoing the permit program. And we know there are a number of suggestions out there on how the program can be worked on, and we look forward to working with the new director because As I tell people, the department is integral to our sustainable communities, policies, and programs in California. We need to make sure that we are dealing properly with hazardous waste in California. We need to make sure that we're dealing with our brownfields. We need to be responsive to our environmental justice communities in California and make sure that we're dealing with the facilities that you sometimes find in those communities. And so we're committed to working with DTSC to make this an efficient program. I think it's fair to say that it is a program that has really never been given the attention that is necessary, and we are committed to working with the department to make this a more efficient program.
All right, and I assume, Mr. Brown, that the LAO's office, and you were here for the entire hearing, you certainly could provide some assistance if requested in terms of enforcement and suggestions for transparency, certainly. So can we count on your office to assist us if necessary?
Yes, of course. We're available to the committee in any way that we can be helpful.
All right. And I have one last budget question that was of interest to Senator Pavley and myself that has to do with the inclusion last year of these environmental justice grants, which were in fact put into the budget, I think, pretty much at the last minute. And there was excess funds, which turned out to be really funds that could have been used for a regulatory program. It's important to have this environmental justice program. Clearly, that was the grants. Do you have a plan to move the program into some regular, permanent, robust funding situation?
Well, two responses. One, we do anticipate that approximately $500,000 in grants will be issued relatively soon. And so we do have a relatively robust program already underway. And in part, that's thanks to the decision by the legislature last year to grant us access to some penalty funds that are in the possession of the State Water Resource Control Board. Previously, we would be in the position of going and asking the various boards and departments within the agency for funding. That provided funding in the past, but it's not stable. And we are looking at whether there are other options within the agency. In fact, I've had some discussions recently about other options we may have to provide a more permanent funding base for the EJ Small Grants program. We recognize that it's a very, very important program, and it's a priority for us to keep that program up and running.
Okay, thank you. We have in front of us the budget of the department and the requests from the budget from the Department of Toxic Substances Control. Thank you to both of you for being here. And it would be my recommendation that we hold all the budget items open. Oh. Thank you.
I believe that there are questions that can be answered, plenty of time to get those questions answered, so I would move we leave the item open.
All right, thank you. And we'll take any public comment on that item before we move. Yeah, the item has been moved. Public comment? Yes, quickly. Yes, yes.
Good afternoon again.
Again.
Amy Vanderwalker, California
Welcome.
Environmental Justice Alliance.
Welcome.
I just want to thank you, Senator Welk, for your attention to the Environmental Justice Small Grant Program. That's really why I'm here today, because it is an absolutely critical program for community-based organizations who are really on the front lines of these environmental justice issues. You know, those are the groups who are actually, helping residents around Exide get connected to lead testing to check what their lead levels are as a result of pollution. So that program is very critical. And as we look at the budget and you see all these multi-million-dollar requests from ARB for data collection, for all these different things, it frankly is really disappointing and dismaying that we still can't find $1.5 million, as is authorized in the last budget, for environmental justice funding within Cal EPA, given the level of importance we all know that it has. So I would really encourage this committee to continue to work with the Cal EPA to find a permanent source of funding for the Environmental Justice Small Grant Program, and thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you, and that concludes public comment. The motion is to hold the Department of Toxic Substances, DTSC, to hold that open. Hold that open. Please call the roll.
Senator Wolk?
Aye.
Senator Nielsen? Senator Pavley? 2-0.
All right, 2-0, that motion carries. Let's move now to the Department. Thank you, Director Lee. All right, the Department of Resources Recovery and Resources Recycling and Recovery, 3970.
Excuse me, Madam Chair.
Yes.
Could I make one comment?
Certainly may.
I was remiss when I spoke to the joint committees earlier in failing to give appropriate credit for the progress on the Exide facility to this body and to the community, and in particular to Senator Lara and President Pro Tem Kevin De Leon. Their leadership has been a tremendous motivator for all of us involved around the facility and guiding us forward. And I genuinely appreciate it, and it would have been wrong for me not to correct that error, so thank you.
Thank you for that. All right, we're in, Director Mortensen, come forward. All right, we have a vote-only, vote-only item first. And the recommendation is to approve. This is for provisional budget language for 2-year grant appropriations to increase the encumbrance availability of 2 Cal Recycle grant programs funds to 2 years. These include Farm and Ranch Solid Waste Cleanup and Abatement Account and the Integrated Waste Management Account, or the Integrated Waste Management Fund. The proposed changes will allow the department additional time to propose, review, award, and manage these grants. Is there a motion? All right, it has been moved that we approve that item. Please call the roll.
Senator Wolk?
Aye.
Senator Nielsen? Senator Pavley? 2-0.
All right, 2-0, that has been approved. Let us move to the next item is the implementation of the single-use carryout bag law. The recommendation is that since there is going to be a referendum, that we reject the proposal. Any comment on that, Director Mortensen?
Susan Montoya, Department of Finance. We concur that there would not be a need in the budget year. We would just note that should the referendum fail to pass, there likely would need to be cleanup legislation because some of the deadlines would be very difficult to meet.
Right. LAO, any comment? No? Director Mortensen?
No comment.
All right. The motion would be to reject the proposal. All right. It has been moved. Please call the roll.
Senator Wolk?
Aye.
Senator Nielsen? Senator Pavley? 2-0.
2-0. Now, funding the beverage container recycling program. All right. Director Mortensen, you begin.
Thank you. So,
And this is an informational item. There is no action being proposed, but very brief overview of this and comment would be helpful, so we know what's in front of us.
Ashley, did you want to go first?
Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ashley Ames with the Analyst's Office. I did prepare a handout for you that should have been passed out by the sergeant, and I will make reference to that as I go through. And I'll make it brief. Just going to provide a brief overview of the beverage container recycling program, which is sometimes referred to as the bottle bill. First, I'll discuss the program's background, its creation, goals, and how it works. Then I'll talk about the program's success with recycling beverage containers. And finally, I'll quickly outline some of the program's expenditures and the current structural deficit. The program was established nearly 30 years ago in 1987, and it was intended to reduce the beverage container component of litter and also to achieve a recycling rate of 80% for containers in the program. It's a self-funding program that encourages consumers to return their beverage containers for recycling by first requiring them to pay a deposit when they purchase the beverage, and then guaranteeing repayment of that deposit for each container that's later returned. If I can draw your attention to page 1 of the handout, you can see how containers are determined to be eligible for the program or not. And to be included, you can see that a beverage must be ready to consume, so not a concentrate or a mix, made from either glass, plastic, or aluminum, so things like cartons and pouches like Capri Sun would not be included, less than 64 ounces, and also not one of the exceptions that's listed. So milk, infant formula, wine, and spirits would not be included. Examples of containers that are in the program would be bottled water, soda, beer, coffee, iced tea, things like that. If a container is part of the program, then consumers pay a deposit when they purchase it, and that's referred to as the California Redemption Value, or CRV. If you turn to page 2, you can see how this flow of CRV and containers works under the program. And there's a lot of detail there, so I won't go into it, but it's there for your reference, and if you have specific questions, I'm happy to address those. Looking at page 3, you can see that the program has been successful at increasing the recycling of containers that are included. When it began, the recycling rate of eligible containers was about 52%, and it has risen to about 85% in recent years. It's also fluctuated over time due to the amount of the CRV, which containers are in the program, and other factors. We also know that the recycling rate today is slightly lower than it was last year. It's currently estimated around 82%, and that's due to some measures that have been taken by the department to reduce fraud. Since the program began, the total number of containers that have been recycled has actually tripled, and that's due to the recycling rate as well as expansions of the program into the types of containers that are included. It's a little bit less clear how the program has affected litter, but the beverage component of litter has likely been reduced given the high recycling rate and since a redeemed container cannot be littered. However, there haven't been recent studies of the litter component. If you turn to page 4, this figure outlines the expenditures from the program's beverage container recycling fund. When containers aren't redeemed or recycled, the state keeps the unclaimed deposit that was originally paid on them. And then this unredeemed CRV supports many other recycling-related programs. Many of these activities and funding amounts are in statute and are continuously appropriated to the department. But they do things like encouraging recyclers to locate in convenient places, providing recycling grants, supporting local recycling programs, reducing the financial burden on some of the participants, and covering the program administration. Because these activities are funded with the unclaimed CRV, when the recycling rate increases, as it has over recent years, there's less money available for them. Finally, if you look at page 5, due to these high recycling rates and the expenditures that we just discussed, the Beverage Container Recycling Fund, which supports the program, has been operating in a structural deficit for some time. The department is currently projecting that it'll be roughly $72 million going forward. We know there was a proposal to address the deficit in the last budget year, but ultimately it didn't pass. And the fund condition has improved somewhat since then. However, the deficit is ongoing and will need to be addressed at some point in the future in order to avoid across-the-board cuts to supported programs as is currently required by state law. With that, I'm happy to take any questions that the committee might have.
Well, I'm going to ask you, after we hear from the Director and Finance, what we're doing in terms of Phase 2 reform and whether legislation is timely this year. So, Director, welcome.
Thank you, Senators. Yeah, I'll jump right into the questions. The write-up was very thorough, and Ashley's summary of the program was much more concise than I've ever been able to deliver, so we'll just jump right in. In the 2013-14 budget, we did about 5 Phase 1 reform actions, and just quickly, those were increased certification requirements for our recycling centers to make sure that they understand the program and what's required of them. And we are working on that. And what we've seen so far is we've seen a small drop in the number of applications that we've got, but we're also seeing a reduction in the number of disciplinary issues we have. So we saw that as a success in that we're probably professionalizing that industry a little bit more. So we're happy with those results so far. We continue doing trainings and those educations and the tests, and those are taking place statewide. The second was the mandated use of DORIS, which is our data system that tracks in money coming in and money going out and material flows. So before it was an optional program. You could do paper reporting or electronic. This change mandated the use of DORIS, and it's becoming, it's given us a lot more data, and we're able to track program participants and money flow a lot easier, and we're able to feed into our efforts on our fraud reduction programs. The third was the elimination of the commingled rate, and this was the rate that was existing at our recycling centers that if you brought in a load of material that had both CRV containers, so you had your beer bottles and your wine bottles, we'd pay you a slightly reduced rate for everything. But now we're only paying for your beer bottles, not your wine bottles. So that did result in a reduction in CRV paid out at recycling centers. We also did daily load limits, which is again affects our recyclers, and we reduced the amount of material that you could bring into a recycling center on a given day, and that was to address some of the fraud issues as well as, and getting back to the original intent of the program was a place for you and I to take our containers in, not for tons and tons of material to be processed. So we're seeing results there as well. And then we do, the last one was working with our sister agency, Department of Food and Ag, on doing work at the border stations. And we required anybody bringing beverage containers into California had to go through a border station and submit a report about what they were bringing in. And this has been a real success and very interesting data set. So we've got about 7,000 of those reports in. And we put all that data together and are analyzing it. We actually put it out and made it public to all our stakeholders and to anybody. And it was interesting to see that on a lot of those reports, we're definitely seeing lots of material coming through, but now it's raising questions about allocation. Is some of our larger participants are looking at those numbers and saying that's not quite what our books are reading. So it's been a interesting exercise, and I think we're going to get a lot more data from that. But so all those together, we estimate that's approximately $45 million in savings, which is great. However, especially on the fraud side of things, is we have to caution about how stable that $45 million is, as we've already gotten feedback from CDFA and some of our local law enforcement partners that people are starting to skirt those border stations because they know we're watching them. So again, with fraud, it's one of those hard things to track because the real bad guys always seem to find a way around what we do. So, but we haven't given up. We're still chasing them. Any questions on the phase one reforms? All right.